Sitting back and analyzing the title of this, our first objective on installing domain controllers, the actual words that Microsoft uses here are very specific in terms of what I believe they want you to know. Notice here that what Microsoft is not talking about is installing Active Directory or any of the tasks involved with preparing for the installation of Active Directory. And that's a really important thing to think about as we're going through the variety of tasks that this module and that objective can cover. Active Directory is a very large set of things, and all of which have to work together in order to create that experience that we're used to. And so Microsoft kind of punts a bit on a lot of the foundational content that is Active Directory itself, like forests and domains and whatnot, in order to focus your attentions down for this objective on just the things you would do with the domain controllers themselves. Here in this module, we'll talk about how you can go about adding or removing domain controllers from a domain. And this is a very specific click-by-click or type-by-type series of steps that you would go through to add that domain controller from a domain. We'll talk about also the installation of a domain controller using IFM or install from media. Every so often, you may have the situation where a domain controller needs to get deployed in some location where the internet connection to that location is really, really poor. And because of that, the replication of that content could take an extremely long period of time. Well, the install from media approach allows you to kind of pre-position some information on that domain controller to reduce the amount of replication that's required to get the domain controller up and operational. We'll also take everything we've talked about having to do with the installation of ADDS and translate that to the command line having to do with the installation of a domain controller on server core. Just a couple of PowerShell commands you need to be aware of here, as well as a variety of just different switches that go with those PowerShell commands, different parameters. We'll talk also about kind of the two ways, the more or less old school way and the new school way involving PowerShell that you can go through in installing a domain controller on server core. And then we'll take everything we've learned and talk a bit about upgrading a domain controller. And in fact, I'm going to go just a bit further with this particular task and give you a little bit of additional information that may or may not be on the test, probably isn't on the exam. That has to do not only with upgrading domain controllers, but upgrading domains and upgrading forests. These can be handy when you have the situation where you need to go from a Server 2008 R2 Active Directory domain to one that's Server 2012 R2 or so on. And so just knowing the quick 5-step process to upgrade a domain controller and the domain and forest it resides in is something you probably should know. Now, Active Directory, the way in which the clients find the servers and services and the way in which each server finds each other has to do with DNS and the different kinds of SRV or service records in DNS that are published by each Active Directory domain controller. Now, every so often you can end up with a situation where a record gets removed or corrupted, or for some reason or another, the domain controller can't update that record or populate that record. Well, when that's the case, you need to figure out how to actually go through resolving those record registration issues. And there are a couple of kind of really slick ways in which you can accomplish that. I'll show you both of those when we get to this part of our module here. We'll talk also about configuring global catalogs and global catalog servers. There's a checkbox you need to know. There's probably a PowerShell command there too you need to know that will enable global catalog on any of the machines that you intend to. Back in the old days, back when our network connections between sites was much, much smaller than it is today, the determination as to where your global catalog should go was much more important. But these days, the amount of traffic that occurs between global catalog servers in combination with just the amount of pipeline that we tend to have between our different sites means that in a lot of environments, at least the ones that I see, you find global catalog turned on every domain controller. Doing so greatly simplifies the planning of your Active Directory, and more importantly, it just greatly simplifies knowing where it's at because every DC is also a GC. And then our final topic here for this module is deploying Active Directory in Microsoft Azure, which I think you will find is perhaps a little less exciting than it might seem to be. The key reason here why I say that is that little acronym there in the middle marked IaaS, which is a shorthand for I'm creating Active Directory on a virtual machine. And so really what we're talking about here in deploying Active Directory is deploying a domain controller in Microsoft Azure. There are, and in the future will be, other ways in which Active Directory can be manifested inside of Azure, more aligned with a service than a service on a VM. But for our purposes here, I want to spend just a couple of minutes showing you that indeed this is possible and giving you a couple of the things you should be aware of should you decide to deploy Active Directory and a domain controller into the Microsoft Azure cloud.